Speaker, I do not believe that this bill actually does that, and because of that, I cannot support it.
I call anybody?
Madam Speaker.
You're calling. Kiritapu Allan.
Madam Speaker, it's an absolute delight to speak on the Commerce Amendment Bill. But I came down, twaddled down from a wee office in Bowen House, and I was making the trek over, and I was quite excited tonight because I thought I was going to be giving a cheerful speech about this whole House being in support of common sense amendments for our Commerce Amendment Bill. Because when I went through, I prepared this great little summary about how, it's not often that we can all agree on striking a pretty finely nuanced, there's a nuanced line between, I guess, enabling a competitive market to get the best from our economy. And as we all know, the competition is a core underpinning of our economic model. But in turn, the purpose of the Commerce Act, the Principal Act, where am I? The purpose of the Commerce Act, already given my speech and everything, is to promote competition in markets for the long-term benefits of its consumers. And so I was heartened when I was reading the remarks of the former National Minister, Jackie Dean. She, particularly with regards to undertaking market studies, this is the bit I couldn't understand. What is the opposition saying? And that's why I came down here to give this jubilant kind of commendation to the whole House, because she said in June 2017 that these proposals, speaking in regards to the market studies, these proposals would include empowering the Commission to undertake market studies and improve its enforcement actions without having to go to the court. It said that it would allow the government to be proactive rather than reactive. But it seems that the opposition has decided to go against what the Honourable Jackie Dean was recommending when she was at the helm for that opposition party, and they've decided to react to common sense legislation for the embitterment of our economy. Now, that doesn't make any sense to me because, look, whilst I'm not a member on the Commerce Select Committee, I am indeed a consumer, and I guess for me it's what strikes, and I want to commend the Honourable Chris Farfoy, because what he has been required to do in a very short amount of time is to strike the balance between enabling competition law and striking it with getting the right balance to enable our economy. And that isn't easy, but there was plenty of work that has been undertaken that was undertaken indeed under the last minister, which is why it's absolutely bamboozling on this side of the House.
There's a gap.
There was absolutely bamboozling on this side of the House to not understand why that side of the House is not supporting common sense legislation. But look, I'll turn to the substantive matters in terms of what this actual amendment bill does. It does three parts. I'm not going to spend too much time waxing lyrical in regards to the airport regulation component, but I do want to touch on the market studies, and I do want to touch on the alternative enforcement provisions. Now, again, it was just this week. I'm going to quote the Honourable. Oh goodness me, my notes are all over the show. Anyway, I want to quote the Honourable Jonathan Young, who this week said, in regards to, wasn't he? Oh, I thought he was on. Well, anyway, they're fine gentlemen from New Plymouth. And he's honourable in character, because I absolutely agreed with his remarks from this week. He said, in regards to this bill that's going through this House, with the great gusto support of the former government, that he said in regards to what happened with BP this week. Now, we all saw that there was a whole range of anti-competitive behaviour, what looks to be anti-competitive behaviour that was shown through a series of correspondence, which we've had a little insight into over the course of the last week. But what that honourable member said from the opposition, he said that that's why the Commerce Commission, he spoke in favour of these amendments. That was why giving the Commerce Commission more power to study petrol market pricing was so important, he said. The Commerce Amendment Bill, the one that this government is currently introducing, the Commerce Amendment Bill introduced to Parliament, there's a quote apparently, on March 28, will give the Commerce Commission the power to study the structure and behaviour of markets and compel organisations and businesses to provide information to them. Now, that was a position just this week of the opposition in regards to these issues. So I don't understand. And, look, many of us sit in and we work pragmatically together, but I just don't understand why you're flip-flopping on such fundamental issues that benefit all New Zealand. Striking the balance between ensuring that consumers get the best in the long run and maintaining a healthy competition. You know that, we know that, but some of us, that side of the house, decide to play politics with an issue that just should not be, a ball to kick around, right? Anyway, so with regard to the market studies, so let's just take, for example, if this week there had been the ability, or if prior to now, there had been the ability when there was some suspicion that there might have been some fiddling going around and some strong-arming in some industries or some markets, for example, petrol and its price fixing, if the Commerce Commission had on reasonable grounds determined that in the public interest it was important to conduct its own inquiry and its own market study, it could have requested information. It could have requested reports, financials, to make sure that every single consumer in New Zealand is benefiting, as it was intended to do under the original Commerce Act, to make sure that all consumers were, in the long run, getting the best from our industry. So I absolutely want to commend. I came down here ready to commend the National Party and Elsa, but anyway, can't do that anymore. I want to commend the work of the Honourable Chris Farfoy. This is a nuance, this is a technical, this is a complicated area of law. Some people know that, and some people spend a lot of their time. And I took the opportunity earlier this afternoon to go through a broad range of submissions that were made on the original inquiry. And I think there was a gentleman that I must turn my mind to it and make commendation of some of his remarks. But I'll start with his conclusion and with a report there again. He was an God, my notes are all over the show. There we go. His name is Donald Curtin, and he was a former member of the Commerce Commission earlier on in the early 2000s, straight after the introduction. He's probably one of your best mates. But one of the things that I found interesting was from his perspective, he said, look, I start from a reasonably pro-business standpoint, and I'm sympathetic to arguments that business with market power must be allowed or even required to compete vigorously, and that the law and jurisprudence must be clear enough, as much as it can be in this difficult context, to avoid dynamic or other chilling efficiency. So effectively, he's going to what the opposition has been saying. But he said, but even from where I stand, as on the pro-business side of things, I think it's reasonably clear that the status quo has failed. Again, I come back to, I cannot understand why the opposition is playing politics with such a significant area of law to benefit all of our communities. Both sides of the House know this. I have no idea what you fellas are up to, but anyway, so even from where I stand, I think it is reasonably clear that the status quo has failed. The test for anti-competitive behaviour is too weak. Its design allows anti-competitive behaviour to slip through. It risks misidentifying potentially pro-consumer behaviour, and so on and so forth. This is a great speech, and he's probably from your quarters. His name's Donald Curtin. I recommend he submits on pretty much everything. Former member of the Commerce Commission. And I think that your side of the House might benefit from sitting with somebody from...
Order. Would the member please stop bringing me into the debate?
My sincere apologies, Madam Speaker. Now, look, we can't wax lyrical. I'm still bamboozled as to what the opposition's up to. But what we do know is that this side of the House is taking pragmatic and prudent measures to ensure the long-term viability and security of consumers. That was the original intention of the Commerce Act, and that is what this Minister of Commerce has done. Effectively, agreed with what your former Minister of Commerce said, agreed with what our good friend Jonathan Young has said just this week, to ensure that issues like BP and everything that we've seen in that correspondence don't have the long-term detrimental effect on consumers. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Madam Chair.
I call the Honourable David Bennett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It was an interesting speech from the last speaker who